From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. A week after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled there's no constitutional right to an abortion, sending the matter back to the states, the controversy and fallout continues nationwide. There is elation from pro-life supporters who believe the court corrected a 50-year error by eliminating the Roe v. Wade legal precedent. Pro-choice supporters remain angry and concerned this latest conservative decision by the High Court might lead to a loss of even more individual rights regarding contraception or even ending same-sex or interracial marriage. In Tennessee, under the state heartbeat law, which passed back in 2020 but is now in effect, abortion is banned after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Under another trigger law passed in 2021, abortion will be all but completely banned when it takes effect in the next few weeks. To assess where things are and where we stand with both the Supreme Court and where the country may be headed, we've asked Dr. John Vile, a renowned constitutional scholar and a political science professor at Middle Tennessee State University, to join us again. Dr. Vile, thank you for joining us again. Appreciate you being on the program.
It's a pleasure. It's been a tumultuous week.
Every summer when the Supreme Court ends its term, there's always a lot of controversy over their decisions. They usually lose the most controversial ones to release at the end. But hands down, I believe this one's had the most pushback, the biggest reaction, pro and con, of any I can remember in my lifetime. What do you think?
I think for end-of-term cases, and I can think of a few others. I can't remember what part of the term Bakke was decided in, but I remember people waiting for hours and hours when they had the oral arguments and then waiting for the decision. Bush versus Gore, of course, was very consequential. Again, not in the sequence. U.S. versus Nixon probably was of equivalent magnitude.
Everybody knows the ruling was coming. I mean, there was a draft decision leaked out a couple of weeks before. But the final document for the court was almost word for word for what the leaked document was. Did the people who pushed it out, nobody knows who leaked it out, was the effort there, you think, to try to make the justices change their mind and change the ruling?
Well, it could have gone either way. It could have been, once it's out there, the court would find it difficult to retreat, or it may have been, should be sort of conservative side, or it might have been someone on the liberal side hoping that, there would be enough public reaction that the court would react to it. So obviously, it didn't work. So
where are we now that you were likely to see? You're already seeing a hodgepodge of regulations. Some states are banning abortions, but not entirely, almost entirely. While other states are continuing to allow such services, even inviting other people from states that don't have it to come get their services there. And then we've seen some states that aren't allowing abortions, their trigger laws being held up by the courts under ideas that they violate their state constitution. I mean, there used to be courts would rule things so they'd bring some uniformity to what was going on issues across the 50 states. This appears to be creating a very different situation, maybe even some chaos.
Yeah, there's something of a parallel here to the 1960s. If you go back to or maybe in opposition to, if you go back to the 1960s, the trend was, let's take all the provisions that are in the Bill of Rights and apply them, sort of one by one to the states, so that, every state's going to have the Miranda rule, or every state's going to have the same search and seizure rule. And this does reflect, for the last 3 or 4, I would say at least since Rehnquist, the court has been moving more in a states' rights direction. And of course, in this case, the court opinion was basically that the Constitution was essentially silent on abortion rights, and there was not a long history of it. And so basically saying the court shouldn't have gotten involved in initially in the issue. Now
we're seeing states, in some cases, saying that they may try to keep their citizens from going to other states to get abortions. Some are also saying they're not going to allow these groups to raise money for it, at least advertise doing that. Here in Nashville, we're seeing 2 resolutions before the council that would allow local dollars to be used for people to go out of state, and maybe even allow it under Metro's employee health insurance program to let that be paid for. I mean, it looks like we're going to have another round of controversy here in Nashville, even though we're in a red state that has basically banned abortion.
Yeah, my own opinion on the subject is that I don't think states are going to be able to prohibit their own citizens from going to another state. Although, ironically, the right to travel, which would be one basis for such a right, is like the right to an abortion, is an unenumerated right. But there's also an additional congressional power to control interstate commerce. And I find it unlikely that Congress would try to. This would be a restriction on interstate commerce that I think Congress would fight against.
There's a restriction on the use of federal dollars to be used for an abortion under the Hyde Amendment.
Yes.
But I don't know if there's anything on the state law or local laws about doing it. Do you expect, if there's an effort to do that in this state, that our state legislature will either come into special session or do it in January to make sure it is against using local or state tax dollars for an abortion in any way?
Well, I think the state could do that. Now, whether I'm not as confident that the state would have the ability to prohibit individuals from providing, say, transportation costs or whatever for somebody to go out of state. I think that would fall under the auspices of the First Amendment.
Now, what about these large companies? I think Amazon and others are already saying they're going to provide these kind of services to their employees if they want to go out of state. Do you think that's probably the last group they'll try to go after to try to keep them from not being able to do that?
I think they'll try. I believe that those companies are going to have the right to fund, interstate transportation. But again, as the last session of the court shows, we're not always as good as predicting as we think we might be.
President Joe Biden this week said now he supports an exception to the filibuster rule in the Senate that would exempt needing 60 votes to codify Roe v. Wade into federal law. But he doesn't have all the Democrats on his side, does he? And getting any Republican support might be almost impossible.
He doesn't. And frankly, it's not clear whether the Supreme Court would uphold a national law on the subject. The suggestions seem, the primary emphasis of the court seems to be on state legislation rather than on federal legislation.
Vice President Mike Pence has said this week that he'd like to see abortion completely banned in all 50 states, passing federal legislation for that. Any chance that can get through either one or both houses of Congress?
I don't think so. I mean, is there a chance that it could happen in the next 10 or 20 years? Yes. If we had a major, what's known as a realigning election that, brought a great majority of either Democrats or Republicans, then you might have legislation, but you might also have pushback from the court.
Dr. John Viles, our guest, MTSU political science professor and constitutional scholar. We're talking about, of course, what's been going on all this week and the controversy across the country about the recent decision by the Supreme Court outlawing Roe v. Wade or taking it out of being a federal right under the Constitution. Back to continue our conversation on the other side of these messages. Stay with us.